And you can see that they projected a price of 22 cents for a litre of milk. What was your average last year, John? Probably somewhere around 30, 32, 33, out by 50%. Soft wheat, 2012, went to about 220, barley about 200 or more, and beef was comfortably over 4. Official forecasts from anywhere need to be treated with a huge grain of salt. And I think it brings us back to the original point made by our welcome Arla speaker, that you expand as your means allow you, while trying to minimise risk, but looking for continuous growth. Julie has already mentioned the fact of course, the beef has gone from an opportunistic third country customer base to very much a top-end European customer base. But again, this is underlain with a series of guarantees across range and traceability criteria that, if seriously breached, can lead to real problems. But it's not just in beef. The dioxin in pig meat happened in Ireland, was dealt with by Ireland, and has done clearly very little damage. But it cost the department and the industry money, but it was money well spent to preserve a reputation and to create a climate which accepted the fact that Ireland was going to be different. Incidentally, how many of you here have a serious risk committee in your companies or co-ops? Now, I don't mean just an audit and risk committee where you have a chat with the external auditor once a year just before the AGM over a cup of coffee. I mean a committee that actually looks seriously at the risks that may be lying there for your business, which haven't been isolated out, haven't been quantified, and have been pretty well ignored or dealt with fairly casually up to now. There's a real, well done, Anne. Yeah, the dairy board. There's one other risk that I hesitate about saying, but it seems to me that with co-ops, and I can say this easier, I suppose, since I'm no longer editor of the journal, is it a risk that your chief executive or your senior executives are not quite on the same page of aspiration for the business as you as dairy farmers might be? Is there perhaps at sometimes a view that status quo is reasonably comfortable, reasonably predictable, reasonably well paid? Why upset the apple cart? Especially if our farmers are getting 40 cents a litre, and there's a view there that we've always had a co-op in this area. The dairy board are there to do the sticky marketing stuff. If there's an odd surplus anyway, we can give it to them. Or even if we occasionally run out of ready credit, they'll buy our stock in advance. By omission, that's a slow erosion. But where there is a real problem, and the chief executive, in fact, runs amok and almost, with the benefit of hindsight, out of control, then the risk is really, really acute for the dairy business and for the co-op structure. And we're not all a million miles from coverage of this kind of event over the last few years. The key question, of course, is how can it be avoided without stifling the development of the business and stifling and curtailing totally the initiative that any good chief executive should have. So I just want to run down a few of the global risks as they struck me as I tried to prepare for this paper and look at best practice elsewhere. The difficulties of health, the degree of sensitivity, the reputational, the credit, the abrupt withdrawal of all credit facilities. I was talking to one of your significant mart managers the other day, 6 months ago, and he said, "No, sorry, we don't give this guy credit. We don't let his representatives into the yard. We don't accept his cheques." I said, "But he's always paid up to now. I know there's always been delays, but he's always paid. Don't care. Too many risks. We're not having him in the place, and we're not taking his cheques. End of story." The guy, of course, has been proved utterly, utterly right in the livestock trade. But of course, the fact was that he was strong enough to take this stance, but other, weaker, more localised marts may not have had the same strength, and were reluctant to let a significant customer off down the road. But the risk was clearly there and was being pointed out, and we were running nasty little pieces saying get paid on the day, either by the factory or by the mart, and don't take it unnecessarily. The end point, of course, is that you're going to have much greater regulatory oversight from the financial regulator in the case of the marts than the softly approach that was coming in from the new regulations over now. Financial. The China experience is interesting, not just on the health side, but the fact that Danone and Starbucks were seen to be profiteering from the demand for foreign goods, and so you get, in dealing with these markets, an official strength that can take the representations to a company in a most unorthodox way, and which wouldn't happen in Europe. And this is undoubtedly a risk in doing business in these countries. The technology. Glanbia in the US cheese market saw the market shift, saw the technology, and has emerged as the pivotal key cheese player in the States. A remarkable transformation. Similarly, the Tetra Pak development led to the erosion of glass bottles, a whole new industry, a whole new technology of liquid milk production. Self-sufficiency in cereals we've mentioned. The regulatory shifts, dismantlement of milk boards, and the shift in the German attitudes. Quality control breakdowns. The abandonment of a brand promise that can absolutely destroy a business. The differing standards that we're going to get, especially now with the talks in Europe. And the tax changes. The Irish tax and 12.5% can come in for criticism, but on a recent trip to Argentina, it suddenly struck me that they had a tax on the export of grain. So what did we find on the main roads back into Buenos Aires? A whole heap of chicken houses. Why? Because the grain was available at below world market prices, so they could suddenly become super competitive in chicken. It never occurred to me, and I don't know how many people it occurs to, that doesn't actually see what's happening. But tax changes, depreciation, talking to an English guy just last week, it's now, once you own farmland for 2 years in Britain, no inheritance tax. Here, what do we find? The department's doing a welcome review, but we're finding the amount of land that can be passed from father to son is reducing in value year after year. Why? Where does that leave us in competitive terms? How much of a risk is that to farm families trying to establish really competitive bases? Subsidy changes. Clearly, really important, as we saw in the recent declines in the suckler herd, and as we've seen in the recent budget, where there has been a reintroduction to some extent. War, Goodman on the brink, and the brand resilience that's there. BSE, disease, only getting into the United States now, and hopefully into China within the next year or two. An interesting risk, which hasn't been mentioned much, but I think it was duly mentioned, the unwelcome beef divergences in the UK of Irish bred and British finished. Let's be absolutely clear about this. What we're seeing is in fact a renationalisation to the greatest extent possible, while recognising their output is below self-sufficiency needs of the British beef market. And it's affecting, to some extent, the enormous dairy board facility at Leek. There is a little red tractor movement in Britain. It's there to try and maximise the return to British farmers. This time of the year, if you're in beef, another risk. There is very clear manipulation of the Irish beef market because there isn't a trade in live fat cattle to Britain. Otherwise, they would be roughly the same, at least throughout the year. But the fact that we can have high prices with a very narrow differential in spring and an extremely wide, consistent differential in autumn gives the view that there has to be a real control of the actual market prices received by farmers in a way that isn't actually there in grain. Relative price shifts are quite clear. The buoyant market that Italy was 3 or 4 years ago has now been replaced by the UK. And trade shifts, the abolition of the sugar policy, of the sugar factories here in Ireland. The other one that I just barely want to mention is the control over the price of inputs. This is a real risk because you can see here phosphate reserves in the Morocco and West Sahara, 78% of world reserves. But there's enough there for 2,000 years at the present offtake of phosphate in these. But if you're a multinational company with preferential access to these deposits, then you're not looking for the cost of production to be replayed back to you. You're looking at what will the market bear. And that's what we've seen in fertilizer and input prices over the last 3 years. This is a seed change which has passed us by. There's only a handful of companies. The Potash Corporation of Canada, they stepped in the other day to prevent it being taken over by foreigners. They were right, but it's got real pricing power. Yara of Norway, Mosaic of the USA. And that's it as regards fertilizer. There's only a few of them. You're the guys that will pick up the bills to keep that share price roaring ahead. It's a risk. What can be done about it is another day. This is a chart I keep on my wall. All through the years, up to 1970-75, a bushel of American wheat bought a barrel of oil. Today it varies between 12 and 17, as you can see. This is a massive, massive transfer of wealth to the Middle East. It's a risk, if you like, that it might go higher, but it's a fact of life that we have to live with. And they're the two definitions. The risk, I would like to think, is something that we can control, but at least let's identify it. The facts of life are there that we've to live with, and let's take whatever means of controlling volatility that we've already heard at this conference. We can all go through life living in a fool's paradise, and it's much more comfortable than not living in any paradise at all. But ultimately, we have to be in business. We have to take a measured assessment of where we stand. And the beginning, I would have said, for any of us in business, is to try and isolate out and write down where are we really exposed. Thank you very much.